Hello, and today we're going to talk about the Korean independence movement. The question that we're going to be discussing is how was Korean independence movement impacted by President Wilson's 14 points? Here's some additional questions to think about as we talk about this topic for today. How does the timeline for Korea's annexation by Japan and subsequent independence movement correspond to that of World War I and World War II? What do Wilson's 14 points say about imperialism, colonialism, and self determination? What was the impact of the 14 points on the Korean independence movement? And how did the United States government respond to Korea's hope of independence? Now, to give some context to this, let's begin with Japan's annexation of Korea. Now, before the annexation of Korea, for many years, during the Goryeo, Shilla, and Joseon dynasties, Korea had been its own sovereign nation for hundreds, 1,000 years. And then here we are now moving towards 1910 with Japan's annexation of Korea. So first of all, why would Japan want to annex Korea? So this was during the age of imperialism. Japan also believed in the policy of imperialism, where an empire was seen as key to modernization of power during this period. And they wanted more living space, resources, and slave labor to make that happen. And Japan also wanted to prevent any other nation, including Russia and the United States, from also controlling Korea. So let's give a little more context. In 1910, Korea was annexed by the Empire of Korea after years of war, intimidation, and political machinations. The country was considered a part of Japan all the way until 1945, so 1910 to 1945. The Empire of Japan waged an all-out war on Korean culture. So if you were in Korea colonized by Japan at the time, schools and universities forbade speaking the Korean language, emphasized manual labor and loyalty to the emperor, and it became a crime to teach history from non-approved text, and authorities burned over 200,000 Korean historical documents. Also during this occupation, Korea took over Korea's labor and land. Nearly 100,000 Japanese families were given land to be settled in Korea. They chopped down trees by the millions and planted non-native species. Nearly 725,000 Korean workers were made to work in Japan. If you're more interested in this topic, this period between 1910 to 1945, I'm sure there's many YouTube videos that also talk about the colonization of Korea during this time period. But we're going to go ahead and move on and talk about the impact of World War I and its shaping of Korea between 1905 to 1910. So World War I began in June 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Later, the United States is also going to enter this World War I in January of 1917. And in January of 1918, 1 year after entering the war, President Wilson, he presents his 14 points, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And in January of 1919, there's the Paris Peace Conference. And eventually in June of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. So this is what's happening kind of all across the world. Let's take now a closer look at what's happening in Korea and what's happening in Korea and Japan. So in 1905, Japan declares Korea as a protectorate. They're kind of watching over Korea in 1905. From February 1906, Japan wrests control of Korean diplomatic affairs and advises all overseas Koreans to submit to Japanese consulates. In July 1907, unhappy with the then King Kojong, Japan forces his abdication and replaces him with his inexperienced son, Sunjong, creating a puppet regime. So this is all the way then leading up to what's going to happen in August the 22nd, 1910, where Japan finally announces the annexation of Korea as its colony and implements some of those repressive authoritarian policies that we discussed a little bit earlier. In January 22nd, 1919, this is now close to 10 years of Japanese colonial rule in Korea, the deposed King Kojong dies under questionable circumstances. There are rumors that he's poisoned, natural unrest among the Korean population. And so, to appease the population, the Japanese permits Koreans to gather freely, because before they were not allowed to gather freely. For the first time, for the king's funeral set in March 3rd, 1919. March 3rd, 1919. So, this is setting the stage for the March 1st movement. So, what happened on March 1st, 1919 in Korea? Well, the March 1st movement begins with a well coordinated mass protests all across Korea. Protesters read the Proclamation of Independence, kind of like the Declaration of Independence in the United States. There's a lot of similarities if you look at the two. And they march through the streets talking about an independent Korea. They do not want to be under colonial rule. Dehan Dongnip Manse. In fact, regularly you'll hear Koreans say Manse a lot, actually. So the whole phrase means long live independent Korea. And then these protests are going to extend for several months. And although these protests are nonviolent by the Koreans, the Japanese government is alarmed by the sheer size and breadth of the movement, and the police come in to crush these protests brutally with ruthless force and arrest. So here's like a map of Korea, and Korea is connected to, you don't see it in this chart here, but it's also connected to China, and a part of actually the northern tip also connects to Russia, and then Japan, an island nation. And so let's take a look at Japan's actions and Korea's objectives. So with the Korean independence movement, Korea is wanting sovereignty. They're wanting the authority of a state to govern itself. They're wanting to govern themselves. Self-determination means the process by which a country determines its own statehood and forms its own allegiances and government. Now, previously, Korea was more of a monarchy, so we're going to see a big transformation actually later in Korea's story as well. Independence, condition of a nation in which resides residents and population exercises self-government over its territories. These are a lot of the freedoms that, of course, we enjoy in the United States, and Korea is also wanting these things. What is happening over here? So for Japan, once again, this is the age of imperialism, and annexation is the forcible acquisition of one state territory by another state. So when Korea is annexed by Japan, it's the forcible acquisition, forcible taking of. And then there's the occupation, the takeover and control of one country by another country. And then colonialism is the acquiring of another country. So Korea becomes occupied, occupying it with settlers, and then exploiting it economically for the benefit of the home country. And then imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through military force. So this is not through self-determination. This is not through the people deciding for themselves, but through military force. And this is not just Japan. Many nations around the world were in this process of imperialism and empire making during this time. What were Wilson's 14 points? The 14-point peace program was a statement of principles for peace that was to be used for peace negotiations in order to end World War I. So that big world war had happened, and peace. This was the plan for peace, the 14-point peace program. The principles were outlined in January 8th of 1918, speech on peace terms to the United States by our president, President Woodrow Wilson. Designed as guidelines for rebuilding of a post-World War, the points include Wilson's ideas regarding the concept of national self-determination. The country decides who they're going to be, with the achievement of this through the dismantling of European empires and the creation of new states. So many of these European empires, we were just talking about Japan, but many of these European countries also had empires all across the world. And so Wilson's idea was for the creation of new states, not these many empires that were all over the world. So here's a list of his 14 points. And what you may want to do is you may want to take a look at, um, read this, pause this video and go ahead and read these 14 points. This is just an abbreviated version, so there's a more lengthy version of Wilson's 14 points that you may want to take a look at later. But here's just a quick overview. So if you pause the video, you could take a look at Wilson's 14 points. But let me go ahead and give you a summary of these 14 points. The 14 points consisted of 8 of them are directions on how to resolve specific territorial issues among World War I combatant nations. How do you resolve these territorial issues? 5 discuss principles for a peaceful world. And then 1 was a plan to establish a League of Nations to enforce peace and protect all countries, great and small. So as you kind of look at this, which one do you think was most important to the Korean independence movement out of all 14? Because definitely these 14 points were used for the Korean independence movement. So what did the 14 points mean for Koreans living under Japanese colonial rule? As we shared, between 1910 to 1945, Koreans were living under colonial rule. And so let's take a look at point 5 here. This is actually the full text. Above was kind of the abbreviated version. This is actually what it says. A free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. And then Wilson goes on further when he gives his speech of this 14 points. This is an excerpt from the end of his speech. Once again, this document really inspiring people in Korea. So let me go ahead and read this portion of the speech. We have spoken now, surely in terms too concrete to admit of any further doubt or question. An evident principle runs through the whole program I have outlined. It is the principle of justice to all people and nationalities and their rights to live on equal terms of liberty and safety with one another, whether they be strong or weak. Unless this principle be made its foundation, no part of the structure of international justice can stand. The people of the United States could act upon no other principle, and to the vindication of this principle, they are ready to devote their lives, their honor, and everything that they possess. The moral climax of this culminating and final war for human liberty has come, and they are ready to put their own strength, their own highest purpose, their own integrity and devotion to the test. So now let's kind of zoom in. We're kind of seeing what's happening all around the world with World War I. We're looked at the annexation between Korea and Japan. And now let's kind of zoom into the actual Korean independence movement. The Korean independence movement was a military and diplomatic campaign to achieve independence of Korea from Japan. It was a 4 decades long endeavor from 1905 to 1945 by Koreans to liberate Korea from Japanese colonization. So after the Japanese annexation of Korea in 1910, Korea's domestic resistance peaked. So there was a constant resistance, but it peaked on the March 1st movement, which eventually crushed and sent Korean leaders to flee into China and the United States. So in China, Korean independence activists built ties with the national government of the Republic of China, which supported the provisional government of the Republic of Korea as a government in exile. So this idea of a Korea existing, but outside of Korea. So Korea was colonized, so they couldn't advocate to be a Korea because they were crushed. But these people fled to places outside of Korea, including China and the United States, to advocate for their own country. So this idea of a Korea existing outside of their own country, that's just such an interesting concept, right? So in the United States, Korean immigrants and Korean Americans played a vital role in the movement. Wow, that's really interesting. So Korean immigrants and Korean Americans in the United States played a vital role in Korea becoming Korea. Let's see how. They contributed money, organized patriotic activities in their communities to raise awareness and issue appeals for support to the United States government. And throughout the years, and from generation to generation, Korean immigrants remain loyal to Korea's cause for liberation. So once again, that period of colonization from 1905 to 1945, that's a long period of time, but they continue to want a liberated Korea. What's so interesting about this story is you would think, it'd be only certain types of people that were involved in the liberation of Korea to want the freedom. But the one powerful story is how schoolgirls became independence fighters in 1919. So at this time, you're going to want to watch that YouTube video, how schoolgirls became independence fighters, how schoolgirls became independence fighters. You're going to want to watch that video. It's about 4 minutes and 19 seconds to give you a little background and context. And you may also want to look more deeply into the actual document, Wilson's 14 points. And so I have a handout that is going to help you dive a little deeper into how did Wilson's 14 points influence the Korean independence movement. So that's it for this first portion. In the next portion, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the next question. How did the Korean independence movement shape and become formed by the Korean American identity in the United States? And that's in the next video.